these are kind of serving as a kind of a personifications and foreshadowing of what Christ is going to do into the future. And so if you actually look up the patriarch saints or whatever you like to refer them as, they actually show some characteristics and some things that are taking place in the New Testament that if you actually put parallels of the Old Testament and the New, you get to see why the New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. With the furthermore of the characteristics are really being exemplified with these particular people. And we're just going to focus a couple because there are a hefty amount. If I'm not mistaken, I have at least like 20-ish, and there's probably even more that I'm missing out. So getting through every single one is going to take a considerable amount of time. So we're just going to focus a couple of ones that really just flow on top of my head. Certain perspective do they resemble of Christ? What do they have association with it? Which is basically the most type of it. You can definitely find it online. Definitely going to be more extensive with this. So keep an eye out for that. So the first one we're really going to focus is basically Adam. There's a lot of things to be said. Actually, there'll be quite three. For the one, he's supposed to resemble the first man. And of course, we have the second Adam, which is referring to Christ. And you really do see this in Romans and 1 Corinthians, just affirming that this is the person that is responsible for our sin. And then the second person, the second Adam that's coming afterwards is going to be the one who will redeem us. And actually, if you actually think about it, if you look at Adam, even the redemption story can shown through him, as various as other people as well in certain aspects of the Bible. But since we're focusing on Adam, it's actually quite interesting that a lot of the things that we get from the New Testament is straight up from even the first three couple of chapters of Genesis. Adam, in the state of sinlessness before he fell, he was put into a deep sleep. God grabbed one of his ribs, which is actually quite interesting. If you look it up, it's one of those things that actually can regrow from the human body and fashion a wife or partner for Adam. And we get that exact same thing in the New Testament. Jesus was crucified, he was killed, and with that symbolic representation of the centurion stabbing Jesus on his side, the church flowed with out of his abdomen, and it was just raining with water and blood. So it's actually pretty interesting that he uses Adam to foreshadow what he was going to do in the New Testament, as when God formed Adam's wife, which was Eve, God the Father formed Jesus' wife, the church, through his side. It's kind of interesting that it just parallels. And just go to back on the first talking point, Adam was in the state of sinlessness just as like Jesus, but unfortunately his story did not end the same way because eventually he did sin, and through Adam we became all sin, rebellion. This is something that we inherit. And so God predestined this way long ago that he was going to take this particular route to redeem human kind to basically be reconciled unto God. So it's very interesting. Like it's almost hard to say to just read this and just completely write it off as the Old Testament and the New have nothing to do with each other, which is opposite of the case. And I guess the only thing that we get to show is since Adam was just purely a human being, he was not God himself. We get to see that there is one particular person that failed to be obedient, whereas Christ was obedient even unto death. So it's actually very interesting. There's probably a lot more that could be said for Adam. But I think those interesting parallels when it comes to playing the fact of the New Testament is just sufficient enough to see that there is quite consideration and kind of like intentional thing that's going on right here. Like it's actually quite amazing that God uses these specific allegories and mentions and why things are either literally or metaphorically placed, because it shows that none of this can be really planned through multiple people. It takes one eternal, complicated, sophisticated mind to basically draw those parallels from even in the first couple of chapters of Genesis all the way into the New Testament. Now, for the next type of Christ is basically Abel. And so actually, if you think about it, Abel didn't do anything. I mean, he probably did something to refer to basically him dying in the state, because again, we do inherit that thing from Adam. However, nothing is really stated from what happened up until his death when Cain killed him out of spite, out of anger. But one of the things that I've seen actually, not written, is that when Abel's blood cried from the blood, from the ground, actually, you get to see the same kind of message being implied with the whore of Babylon, where she consumes the blood of the saints, which is something that it becomes a reoccurring theme in the book of Revelation. And it's quite interesting that we see that even with the start of Abel. Abel was considered a saint at this point. And you get to see that there is some parallels there when it comes to the saints and the patriarchs, knowing that the fact that Abel was actually the first martyr, if you really think about it. And another thing that's actually quite interesting, Abel actually serves as the acceptable sacrifice. Now, there is some discussion between why God accepted his sacrifice versus the other. But I think it's just due to the fact that since God is omniscient, he knew what Cain was going to do. And so rather than taking this as Cain's murder, it was actually his sacrifice. And another thing to also notice that Cain killed his brother by means of stoning. I mean, it's not really just the act of itself, but the fact that he bludgeoned his own brother with rocks. I can see why God uses that just to basically show like this is the result of anger, of sin, basically. And I think that's what he has disdain for. He doesn't have disdain for basically in the same sense as Cain. He has that disdain for sin itself, using the same method that Cain killed his brother for. So that's actually quite interesting insight. And I guess the last thing is to mention is Cain was also slain by his own kin, his own brethren. So I think this is supposed to be allegory for what Christ has undergone through. And this is the point where Christ was basically judged by the high priest at the time. And he was basically making that claim that he was God. And so the same people that he grew up with, his own literally kindred, just turned them to a Gentile, which is, of course, we know Pontius Pilate, and just basically hand them over for death, trying to alleviate the responsibility of basically killing their own, and essentially feeling free of accountability for what they were pushing for. But I think it's super interesting that the reoccurring theme from the New Testament is really present, again, even in Genesis. And I guess we'll just finish in with just Noah. I mean, there's a bunch more like Job and Dave and so forth and so forth. But I do suggest you read it. I mean, I'm going to have it available. And so if you're interested in buying the book or just seeing the notes that are just really available, I just suggest you do so, copy it, and even make notes of your note. I'm pretty sure God will show you even more so that I currently have. And so what's interesting with Noah is that it kind of plays into the same thing with Adam and Abel and Jesus, where again, Adam goes to a deep sleep, and you can just try to interpret that as rest, which wouldn't be too off. And God goes under through the same thing. He goes through a slumber. He goes to the realm of the dead for 3 days, and then he comes back and he redeems, and he is alive again. And so Noah, if you actually translate his name into the Hebrew language, it actually means rest. And I do have, again, in my notes, a section about each name meaning to something. So it's like another segue into the Trinity being present in the Old Testament. And another thing that shares similarities between Noah and Christ is that Noah actually became, I guess, in a way, the first kind of I can't even say it anymore. The person that goes in between man and God and kind of a hope of salvation. God chose Noah and his 3 sons and wives, and of course his own wife, that they were deemed basically worthy of compared to every other person that existed at the time. And so there, God instructed him to create an ark, which is very similar to the Ark of the Covenant, and of course Jesus, where he calls all the animals and of course Noah's family to go inside this the only interest, which is kind of symbolic to John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so the fact of it is that Noah actually foreshadows Christ's salvation, which he is basically the one who is going to save us and provide the means for it. And it's actually quite interesting because we do read that at the end of that account of Noah's ark, that God sends a rainbow, that he promised he will not destroy the earth anymore, or mankind really, by the means of water. But in the book of Revelation and other books as well in the Old Testament, even to some extent the New Testament, talks about the world being flooded by flames. So I think it's actually quite poetic in a sense. I mean, it might seem a little bit of grim to some people, but nevertheless, I do find it very interesting that God finds it a specific way to tie it back. I mean, there's that one passage in the Bible talking about the end of days will be like days of Noah. just showing that there is not going to be exactly the same, but kind of similar in nature. And so I think that this was like one of those things where he uses abundance of something, with either by water or by fire, to completely judge the earth, which is exactly what Christ is going to do in those last days.